Protecting yourself from others is a frequent reason for our behaviors, and we are highly motivated to shield the ego for many reasons. The ego's instinct to protect itself can be reality-bending and can cause mass intellectual dishonesty and self-deception. As such, this is another highly predictable indicator we can use to analyze people's behavior. Someone who's underperforming at work might feel the need to protect their perceived skills and talent by deflecting responsibility to, "The boss has always had it in for me. And who trained me? Him. It's all his fault, one way or another." Someone who trips and falls yet fancies themselves graceful will blame the fact that it rained 6 days ago, their shoes have no grip, and who put that rock there anyway? Someone who fails to make the school basketball team will grumble that the coach hated them. They weren't used to that particular style of play, and they didn't really want to make the team anyway. This is what it sounds like when the ego steps in to protect itself. There's so much justification and deflecting going on that it's difficult to know what is real and what is not. This all stems from the universal truth that nobody likes to be wrong or to fail. It's embarrassing and confirms all our worst anxieties about ourselves. Instead of accepting being wrong as a teachable moment or lesson, our first instinct is to run from our shame and cower in the corner. This is the same reason we will persist in an argument to the death, even if we know we are 100% wrong. If the ego had a physical manifestation, it would be sizable, sensitive, and heavily armored, to the point of going on the offensive. Essentially, a giant porcupine. When the ego senses danger, it has no interest or time to consider the facts. Instead, it seeks to alleviate discomfort in the quickest way possible, and that means you lie to yourself so you can keep the ego safe and sound. We try to cover up the truth, deflect attention from it, or develop an alternative version that makes the actual truth seem less hurtful. And it's right in that moment that intellectual dishonesty is born. Are any of those convoluted theories likely to withstand any amount of scrutiny? Probably not. But the problem is that the ego doesn't allow for acknowledgement and analysis of what really happened. It blinds you. Let's be clear. These aren't lies that you dream up or concoct in advance. You do not intend to lie to yourself. You don't even feel their lies. You may not even know you're doing it, as sometimes these defense mechanisms can occur unconsciously. They're not explicitly intellectually dishonest because you want to delude yourself. Rather, they're automatic strategies that the constantly neurotic ego puts into action because it's terrified of looking foolish or wrong. Unfortunately, that's the worst zone to be in, as it means you don't know what you don't know. Over time, these ego-driven errors in thinking inform your entire belief system and give you rationalized justifications for almost everything. You never make any sports team because the coaches always hate you, and you keep failing the driving test because your hand-eye coordination is uniquely special. These lies become your entire reality, and you rely on them to get yourself through problematic situations or to dismiss efforts to find the truth. We're not talking about just giving excuses for why you aren't a violin virtuoso. This manner of thinking can become the factors that drive your decisions, thinking, and evaluations of anything and anyone. So if you're struggling to understand why someone who doesn't appear to be able to utter the words, "I'm wrong," now you know exactly what's going on in their head. They may not know, but at least you're able to analyze them more deeply. Let's take Fred. Fred was an ardent fan of a pop star his whole life. He grew up listening to his music and formed a lot of his identity around his admiration for him. We're talking an entire bedroom wall filled with posters of this star and outfits that were replicas of this star's clothes hanging in his closet. Late in his career, this pop star was put on trial for a serious crime. Fred steadfastly stood by his pop star idol, even as lurid details of his case were reported by courtroom reporters to the press. "Nobody I admire this way would ever be guilty of this," Fred said, It's all just a conspiracy put together by the people who resent him for whatever reason. The pop star was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to multiple years in prison. Fred had shown up outside the courthouse bearing a sign that protested his star's innocence. Even as compelling evidence was eventually released to the press, Fred maintained that the pop star was absolutely innocent, dismissing all of the victims' claims by protesting that they were jealous or just trying to get the spotlight themselves. Why would Fred continue to insist, against all reasonable and provable evidence, that his idol was innocent? Because his ego was so wrapped up in his worship of the pop star that it was predisposed to consider him blameless. For him to believe the truth would have meant a devastating blow to almost everything he believed in. I worship a criminal? What does that say about me? And the ego wasn't going to let that happen for a minute, even if it meant making him deny what was fairly compelling and unshakable proof that the star was guilty. In your pursuit of truth and clear thought, your ego will rear its ugly head like the enraged porcupine. It has set up a series of tactical barriers to keep you from learning something that might upset your belief system, and it's only after you can rein in your ego that you are open to learning. After all, you can't defend yourself and listen at the same time. Defense mechanisms are the specific ways we protect our ego, pride, and self-esteem. These methods keep us whole when times are tough. The origin of the term comes from Sigmund Freud. These so-called defense mechanisms are also a powerful predictor of behavior and will give you a deep insight into why people do what they do. Defense mechanisms can take many varied and colorful forms, but there are a few common patterns that you'll see in others, and hopefully yourself. These psychological shields rear up when the ego senses something it doesn't agree with, can't face, or wishes wasn't true. Loss, rejection, uncertainty, discomfort, humiliation, loneliness, failure, panic, all of these can be defended against using certain mental tricks. These mechanisms are there to protect us from experiencing negative emotions. They work in the moment, but in the long run, they are ineffective since they rob us of the opportunity to face, accept, and digest inevitably negative emotions as they crop up. Naturally, if you can observe somebody using a defense mechanism, you can instantly infer a lot about them and their world, particularly about the things they find themselves unable to deal with. This in turn tells you a lot about how they see themselves, their strengths and weaknesses, and what they value. Let's look at some defense mechanisms with concrete examples. You just might recognize these two defense mechanisms put forth by his daughter, Anna Freud: denial and rationalization. Hello, listeners. We're going to break from the episode for just a moment to bring you a word from our sponsor, Let's Get Checked. You know now about the availability and importance of the male hormone test, but Let's Get Checked has a full suite of wellness tests designed for those who want to take control of their health. A simple at-home test can give you insight into the health of your thyroid, liver, colon, and kidneys. You can also check for blood levels of cortisol, cholesterol, your vitamin levels, iron and omega fatty acid levels, folate, and C-reactive proteins. Tests are available to help you diagnose and manage Lyme disease, diabetes, and celiac disease, as well as their new, less invasive test for COVID-19. Take a moment to check out their full line of health and wellness tests and get your 20% discount by going to trylgc.com/NMG. That's trylgc.com/N as in Newton, M as in media, G as in group. And now, let's get back to the podcast episode. Denial is one of the most classic defense mechanisms because it is easy to use. Suppose you discovered that you were performing poorly at your job. No, I don't believe that report ranking all of the employees. There's no way I can be last. Not in this world. The computer added up the scores incorrectly. What is true is simply claimed to be false, as if that makes everything go away. You're acting as if a negative fact doesn't exist. Sometimes we don't realize when we do this, especially in situations that are so dire they actually appear fantastical to us. All you have to do is say no often enough, and you might begin to believe yourself, and that's where the appeal of denial comes in. You are actually changing your reality, where other defense mechanisms merely spin it to be more acceptable. This is actually the most dangerous defense mechanism, because even if there is a dire problem, it is ignored and never fixed. If someone continued to persist in the belief they were an excellent driver, despite a string of accidents in the past year, it's unlikely they would ever seek to practice their driving skills. Rationalization is when you explain away something negative. It's the art of making excuses. The bad behavior or fact still remains, but it's turned into something unavoidable because of circumstances out of your control. The bottom line is that anything negative is not your fault, and you shouldn't be held accountable for it. It's never a besmirching of your abilities. It's extremely convenient, and you're only limited by your imagination. Building on the same prior examples of poor job performance, this is easily explained away by the following. Your boss secretly hating you. Your coworkers plotting against you. The computer being biased against your soft skills. Unpredictable traffic affecting your commute, and having 2 jobs at once. These flimsy excuses are what your ego needs to protect itself. Rationalization is the embodiment of the sour grapes fable. A fox wanted to reach some grapes at the top of a bush, but he couldn't leap high enough. To make himself feel better about his lack of leaping ability, and to comfort himself about his lack of grapes, he told himself the grapes looked sour anyway, so he wasn't missing out on anything. He was still hungry, but he'd rather be hungry than admit his failure. Rationalization can also help us feel at peace with poor decisions we've made with phrases such as, "It was going to happen at some point anyway." Rationalization ensures you never have to face failure, rejection, or negativity. It's always someone else's fault. While comforting, where do reality and truth go amidst all of this? Well, out the window mostly. Intellectual honesty requires you to first defeat your natural tendencies to be dishonest. Thoughts dictated by self-protection don't overlap with clear, objective thoughts. Closely associated is repression. Whereas in denial the reality is refused or downright rejected, repression is where a person pushes the thought or feeling so far out of consciousness they forget it. It's as though the threatening emotion never existed in the first place. An example might be the child above who experiences abuse. Because it is so painful, and because they had no way of helping themselves, they might push the memory so far away that they never have to deal with it. Sometimes, the overpowering emotion is unwelcome, but what is really unacceptable to the ego is where it comes from. In such a case, displacement might occur as a protection against unpleasant truths. A woman might work at a job she hates, but cannot realistically leave. Simply, she cannot express or even acknowledge that she resents her job, because this draws a threatening attention to her financial bind. What she might do, though, is take that resentment and put it elsewhere. She might come home every day and kick the dog, or yell at her children, convinced that they are the ones making her angry. It's easier and less risky to confront her feelings of anger when they're directed to her pets or children. Projection is a defense mechanism that can cause considerable damage and chaos if not understood for what it is. In this case, we place unwanted or unclaimed feelings onto someone or something else rather than seeing that they are a part of ourselves. We do not recognize our own dark side and project it onto others, blaming them for our shortcomings or seeing our flaws in their actions. An example is a man who is cheating on his wife. He finds his own behavior unacceptable, but rather than allow himself to condemn his own actions, he projects that shame onto his bewildered partner and is suddenly suspicious of her behavior, accusing her of keeping something from him. The example of a blatantly homophobic man who is revealed to later be gay is so common by now it's almost comical. Reaction formation just might be behind it. Whereas denial simply says, this isn't happening. Reaction formation goes a step further and claims, not only is that not happening, but the exact opposite is the case. Look. A woman might be terrified of her new cancer diagnosis, and rather than admit her fear, puts on a show to everyone of being courageous, preaching to others about how death is nothing to fear. In times of extreme emotional distress, you might find yourself regressing to a simpler time, i.e., childhood. When you were young, life was easier and less demanding. To cope with threatening emotions, many of us return there, acting childish as a way to cope. A man might be facing some legal troubles over misfiled taxes. Rather than face the situation, he gets into a screaming match with his accountant, banging his fists on the table in a tantrum, and then pouting when people try to reason with him. Finally, we come to sublimation. In the same way that projection and displacement take the negative emotions and place them elsewhere, sublimation takes that emotion and channels it through a different, more acceptable outlet. A single man might find the loneliness at home unbearable and channels that unmet need into doing charity work 4 nights a week. A woman may receive some bad news, but rather than get upset, she goes home and proceeds to do a massive spring cleaning of her home. A person might routinely turn panic and anxiety into a dedication to prayer, and so on. Defense of the ego is a nasty habit, but it's easy to recognize when you know of its insidious presence. Sometimes we can't help it. We're all human. But we can use this to our advantage by using it as a clear quantity to analyze people with. This has been Think Like a Psychologist: How to Analyze Emotions, Read Body Language and Behavior, Understand Motivations, and Decipher Intentions. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2019 by Patrick King. Production copyright by Patrick King. Hello listeners, this is Russell with Newton Media Group, and on behalf of myself and Patrick King, we'd like to thank you for the time you've given to the podcast and hope that you've found it useful in your daily life. We value your time, which is why our episodes begin immediately with content, but we also highly value your opinion and would greatly appreciate if you would leave us a rating and a review in your podcast provider. Also, don't forget, if you'd like a copy of the free mini book on conversation tactics, take a moment and visit patrickkingconsulting.com to request your free copy.